You're listening to the To Write Love on Our Arms podcast, a show about mental health and the things that make us human. Welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of the To Write Love on Our Arms podcast for season 5. It's wild that we've already been here for 5 years, and we know that as we try to get new angles on familiar topics, that we have a lot of different perspectives on how we can address different mental health challenges and behavioral health challenges. So today, it's my honor to bring to the table my friend Michelle Moore, who has been part of the To Write Love story from our earliest days. So even now, 16 years into our story, it's so good to connect with some familiar faces. So, Michelle, today we are talking about a topic that many of our audience is familiar with. That's the topic of non-suicidal self-injury. And before we dive into questions and the specific angles that we're taking in this conversation, just want to give you some space. How did you get connected to us? How did you get brought into this specific conversation about self-injury?
Yeah, that brings me back probably over a decade. I can't believe I'm that old, but I was, I guess, mid 2000s. I was in graduate school, and Aaron, my husband, he and I own a practice together in Orlando, and he was working as a counselor for a nonprofit community mental health center here in Orlando. And I guess on his break, he was reading this article about Jamie and To Write Love on Our Arms and the MySpace page, if you can believe it. And so he, I guess, had his email, and he emailed him and was like, "Hey, man, I love what you're doing. Can I connect with you?" And so we connected, actually in Satellite Beach. I remember we were surfing and we met Jamie at, I guess, Roadhouse on
That sounds right.
right by the causeway. I think it's his favorite place. Anyway, so from there, we had just got plugged into To Write Love in Our Arms, met Renee, met the family, met other key important people, and just started brainstorming with them about what what it could look like. I was in grad school at the time, like I said, and I was starting my internship, my practicum. So I was seeing clients, and I was still in my 20s. So, my supervisors was like, "You're going to see a lot of the younger people," which was great because I wanted to work with adolescents and college students. And so several of them, one of them actually had the To Write Love on Our Arms shirt. And I was like, "Whoa, I just met the guy. I just met them." And she was like, "No way." Long story short, I really tried to dig in and learn more about self-harm, just from not just from the To Write Love on Our Arms story and Renee's story and many other people's stories, but also my clients' stories, and see how I could better understand this issue so that I could come alongside them in ways that I just was not prepared to do so. So, yeah, that's kind of how we got connected. So I think that was a long time ago. So, yeah.
Today's episode, like I mentioned, is all going to be about non-suicidal self-injury, but we're taking a unique perspective on it. Last year, you may be familiar that we spoke with our friend Lori Van about the prevalence, about the data, about people who may be specifically struggling with this. And today, we want to kind of shift topics a bit. So the mission statement at To Write Love on Our Arms is that we exist to present hope and find help for anyone struggling with depression, addiction, self-injury, and suicide. And I love the space that exists in that mission statement. Anyone struggling with. That includes friends and family members who are struggling with how they can care for people that are in some dangerous and some really murky places. So that's what today's topic is about. For you listeners who are friends, who are family members, who are loved ones, who are children, spouses, mentors to people who may be struggling with self-injury, this is an episode dedicated to you. So to dive right in, We often ask questions with the direct hope of helping an individual who's struggling. But let's again just take a beat and start with people who maybe are suspicious, maybe people that have questions, maybe people that have been picking up on some hints that a loved one may be struggling with self-injury. Michelle, what are some signs that may maybe we should be more aware of? Maybe we should have it top of mind as we're starting to frame how we could have a conversation that may feel a little bit awkward.
I would start with, a lot of times self injury happens as a result of maybe a mental health diagnosis like depression or anxiety or, recovering from post traumatic stress disorder, other things, mood disorders, things like that, eating disorders. So, a lot of times, what I kind of see as, I guess you could say, a prerequisite is that there is something that you notice with your friend or loved one that may not be that like them, they're not themselves. They may be struggling, and with maybe you notice more meltdowns, more episodes of crying, or maybe isolation, or substance use, or an eating disorder, or maybe something terrible happened to them in the past, and maybe you notice them sort of shutting down. So a lot of times I think those are more the obvious signs, is that you start to see someone just not themselves, or maybe they're not how they normally are, and it's for a period of time, not just like they have an off day. It's weeks turns into months, turns into several months. That's usually in my mind some of the first signs that you see. Other signs, more obvious signs, would be, uh, you know, self injury can be many different forms. So it's not just cutting of the skin, although that's usually the first thing we think of when we think about self harm. But it can be other types of self harm, but something that is done to the body. So that could look like bruises, unexplained scratches or bruises, or wounds that don't heal. Skin can be some forms of skin picking, things like that. So you might see obvious signs of tissue damage towards on the person's skin, but oftentimes you don't notice that. The person struggling typically keeps them pretty, uh, um, what's the word I'm looking for, covered, or they aren't noticeable, or there's some explanation for those wounds or scars or scratches, whatever the tissue damage may be. But that's more of the obvious sign, like that you see some kind of tissue damage, or you see someone trying to cover up their body in attempt to hide or camouflage those scars or those wounds.
Yeah, I actually love that you led with the emotional signs before we got to the physical signs.
Mm-hmm.
In part because that implies that we are referencing someone who is more or less consistent in our life, that we have a baseline understanding of what their day in, day out mood looks like. And that enables us to be more aware of moments that seem kind of off script, or things that seem a bit out of the ordinary. And I think that that's something that's super important, that people that are struggling with things like self injury, that there's there's a purpose that's driving this. And I think perhaps before we get
Mm-hmm.
further into this conversation, it's important to know what self-injury is and what it's not. I reckon a lot of people listening to this may instantly be concerned that if they suspect someone in their life is self-injuring, that perhaps there is an immediate risk of suicide as well. Would you be able to draw out what distinguishes um, non-suicidal self-injury from something that may be more in line with an attempt of suicide?
Right. I think that is a common myth. I'm glad you clarified that, Chad. That a common myth is that self harm or evidence of self-harm is an attempt to end one's life, and that often it's not. Most often it is a result of a trying to cope with internal emotions, internal feelings that are going on the sort of inside or internally that is outwardly expressed. So, no, I would say that most often the confusion is that, oh, is this person trying to end their life? And most often it is not. So, self harm, the way I think of it is, it is a deliberate um, damage done to one's body, tissue, but oftentimes there's a precipitate event, meaning there's something that happens to cause someone to want to do it. And usually that there's there's a it acts like a coping mechanism, and that is what serves as the function of the behavior. So, if they're, let's say, struggling with an eating disorder, and they are really upset with themselves because they engage in eating disorder behavior, and as a way to cope with that anxiety or internal emotion, they will self-harm as a result to relieve some of that tension, relieve whatever may be going on in the inside. Sometimes it is meant to, serve that behavior is meant to serve a function, and that function can be varied depending on the person and the circumstance. So it's not just one thing. Like, a lot of times people think, oh, you're just doing it for attention, and that is also another myth, that it's not done for attention. It really is done to communicate something, and oftentimes to themselves, that they're in pain, that they're trying to, even relieve pain, trying to feel something better, trying to, you know, um, deal or cope with whatever is going on inside, like the dysregulation that they're feeling internally.
I love that idea that you brought up at the end, the idea of regulation. That this is a way to try to assert control. If you have a headache, you take some Advil. Why? Because you found that it works. In the same way, and in my own story, as someone who has struggled with self injury, it was a form of self medication of sort
Mm-hmm.
of self regulation, a way to kind of assert control over something that felt controlless.
Mm-hmm.
So with this, obviously, you were talking about people going to certain lengths to cover this up. That is not a cry for help if you are trying to hide
Mm-hmm.
what is going on. So
Mm-hmm.
things like stigma and shame often
Mm-hmm.
come attached to self injury, and we know that creating a non-judgmental environment is so important.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of links back to the first question, but how would you suggest someone go about creating and becoming that sort of non-judgmental environment? Where is the line between policing behavior and expressing concern for someone's well-being?
It's interesting. I think in my experience, I work a lot with adolescents and adults. And from my experience, granted, this is just my experience, but I find that adolescents, like the younger population, is better at this than people my age, including myself. There, I think sometimes, let's say if the person that you're concerned about is a young, between the ages of like 12 or 24, I feel like sometimes their peers can be very understanding, empathetic, and come at it with a non-judgmental stance. Sometimes I think parents, I myself am a parent, so I get it, but oftentimes I think that's when we tend to come at it like more like freaked out. We're more scared. I think the fear drives a lot of that reaction or that response, which is understandable. I mean, honestly, it like you can know all the knowledge and have all the insight in the world, but when it comes to someone in your own family, I think sometimes our responses are just automatic. So I think, if we're talking about a friend peer to peer, I think sometimes that can be an easier relationship in terms of relatability and coming at it from a non-judgmental stance. Although there's exceptions, sure, but I think when it's parent to child or parent to loved one, sometimes I think it's harder. Not harder and like the other one isn't hard, but I think we have to sort of, as parents or caregivers, have to manage our own responses and what it brings up in us first and
Mm.
foremost before we're able to offer that non-judgmental stance or that compassion or empathy towards our loved one.
Yeah,
Do
that is really where the loadedness of that question comes in, right? When it's almost as if you get closer in proximity emotionally, whether that's a parent relationship with a child or a consensual romantic relationship between you and your partner. Sometimes that can be almost too close. It evokes questions from the caregiver of, oh my God, was this my fault? What role did I play in my loved
certainly.
one having these struggles? Or how did I miss these signs? And we'll get to some of those nuances in a little bit. But I think what you mentioned earlier is super important. You almost have to desensitize yourself to the behavior, to the action, and to the results of some of this self-regulation behavior, and focus on what is beneath that. What really, if self-injury is essentially a symptom of a dysregulated life, of a life that feels out of control, then that's what needs to be addressed. Because even if you only address the surface layer of the problem, then we're left to find other ways to cope,
Mhm.
other ways to deal with the pain. So yeah, I think, I don't know, just pausing there for a moment. I think it's important that as those that are seeking recovery from self-injury try to suss out who they can and cannot trust at this particular moment with their story, is perhaps the call to not be offended if you aren't the first to know, to not feel
Mhm.
left out,
Mhm.
um, but to, yeah, I mean, I guess what are some tips, or maybe what are some models of ways that you've seen mentors and loved ones and caregivers be an ally, if we agree that having a non-judgmental environment is important, and we agree that people are going to be the ones to make up this environment. I guess let's stay there for a second. What role do people play? What role does community play in terms of caring for or modifying
Mhm.
a specific behavior?
It's it's probably so broad we could spend all day talking about that, right? I think, what comes to mind, and hopefully you can tell me if this is kind of where you're going with this question, but what comes to mind is, let's say an adolescent is struggling, someone like middle school, high school, struggling with self harm, and their friend notices, and they kind of, maybe, hey, what's going on? I notice you're struggling, and that person shares with them that they are. I think I think even just in that, I think that relationship, there's care and concern. There's enough interactions. There's enough um, even physical interactions. It's hard, especially during COVID. Everything's been so isolated, everything's been so separated. Like, you might not have seen your friends in 2 years or a year because you've been in your bed doing school, and they're doing school in their bed, so there may not even be that physical interaction. But I think a lot of times when there is, like, that sort of is the setting stage, is just friendship, right? Is
Mm.
care and concern, and offering, that listening ear. Like, hey, I noticed that you're struggling. What's going on? Are you okay? How can I help? I think oftentimes, like, we tend to go into a caretaker role. Like, we want to fix it. We want to make it better. and realizing that that's more about us, and taking a step back and realizing like that's probably not what they need.
Yeah.
Even as like parents, a lot of times they may feel like they're the last to know that their friends, or maybe if it's their partner or spouse or their adult child, maybe they feel like they're the last one to know. And so I think that's hard too. Like you said, it's hard to not take it personal. um, but yeah, I think sort of the setting stage is just probably friendship and community, and caring for one another with that love and respect and unconditional regard. I think it's the same
Mm.
true with like families. If there's space to have communication with your family members that's open, without fear of getting in trouble or something bad happening, or broken trust, um, like there's not a fear of recourse. I think that can open the lines of communication.
I think it's so important to realize that as we're talking about community's role in helping people who may be struggling, you have to understand what the context of the community is. Why are we coming together? Why are we uh, uh, investing in one another's story? And it's not just specifically for these flashbulb moments of a behavior or of a tragedy. Hopefully, you have a sense of community. You have an idea of where you can go to get that unconditional positive regard, despite whether today is a great day or a horrible day. I say that to mention, I think it's so important for caregivers to kind of be open to what a success looks like in caring for a friend or a family member. That success is not going to be defined by how long a period of recovery is or was before a relapse or a complete cessation of a behavior. Success is knowing that your loved one knows that you're trustworthy, that you're a safe place, that you're someone that believes in them. I've said it so many times over the years that what you believe does not matter as much as your loved one knowing that you believe in them, right?
Yeah,
So whether you have this idea all drawn out on a 5-step plan to recovery, what really matters is this person knowing that you're going to have their back, whether they're calling you to say, hey, it's been 5 days, it's been 5 weeks, it's been 5 months, or hey, I just slipped up. How can
mm-hmm.
we get through this?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just a reminder to those listening that may be envisioning friends, family, loved ones that are struggling, that uh, it is so important to empower people, to build the community that they think will be most beneficial. Now, it's I think a good thing to drop hints, remind them of resources that exist, remind them of maybe groups that can help with self care, maybe involving mental health professionals and counselors. But I know for me, my family did not know about my self injury until I was months and even over a year into my recovery, and that was intentional, because I needed to rely on friends first before I took steps into something that was a bit more, closely related, as it were. All that being said, not everyone is going to fill the same role in a community. In fact, that's what makes a community beautiful, is its diversity of players in it.
Right, but
So I
even,
just, yeah.
not to interrupt, Chad, but I think it's been so hard these past 2 years during this COVID pandemic to have community,
Hmm.
right? Like so many of us are isolated because of that, social distancing and online schooling and work from home, that our community has been very disrupted. And that has
Yeah.
played recognizing like that has played a huge part in all of this, even in just mental health, for you yourself and for the person that you're caring for or concerned about. That a disruption of community has been really impactful, and in some ways great. Like, it's provided access to people, you know, in places like, a lot of my clients are on Discord, right? Like, they're able to do like messaging things that connects them to people in other parts of the world, or the United States. But I think from a deeper perspective, it has caused us to kind of withdraw and feel more isolated. And I think that's probably a common theme among
Yeah.
pretty much everyone. Yeah. So I think
That
that,
that's
that's a unique place. Like, when we're talking about community, it's like, well, how can I have community when I don't see anyone? You know, it's
Yeah.
hard.
I mean, having this conversation in 2022 is radically different than, when we would have had this conversation 5 years ago. And I mean,
Right.
God, Michelle, we've had this conversation how many times over the
Right.
past 14 years. But yeah, I think that's so important to realize that this year, this month, this context is so different from before. And as we're talking about community, there's certainly points where our community feels restricted and maybe even more clearly draws out some shortcomings in what we are able to provide for our friends, for our family members. Uh, you loving your family, you loving your friend does not make you a licensed mental health professional. There's going to be questions that come up that you aren't going to be able to answer confidently or competently, and that's okay.
Mhm.
But we do know the value of seeking help, of finding professionals, of reading proper literature and getting your information from vetted sources.
Mhm.
So, what
Definitely.
might seeking out professional help on behalf of another person with their approval look like? How important is it to find someone that maybe even specializes in self injury recovery and treatment?
Mhm. Yes. I mean, I think, you know, if you have a phone or access to the internet, you could probably access care, or even, because a lot of mental health care is through telehealth now because of COVID. Uh, a lot is still in person, but there's a lot more accessibility due to changes in regulations and also technology, and everyone sort of pivoting, I guess you could say, into more being comfortable with telehealth counseling, and using professional help through the use of a phone and the internet. So I think in terms of accessibility, it's greater. So that's good. I do think it is important to do your research, interview people, find out what their education is, how they approach this issue, in terms of like what type of therapy they provide. Are they, a licensed credential clinician? Because it might even mean different types of providers and not just one. So
Yeah.
oftentimes when I meet with families, initially it's the family doctor or the pediatrician that is the first to identify that this is an issue because of, just family or wellness checks or things like that. Sometimes it is friends. And so it's encouraging, people to get help. And so I think it's from a very young age, just know what your resources are, know who are the right people to talk to, whether that's the safe. In Florida, they have what they call safe counselors in a lot of public schools, and they are often the first contact. So if, let's say, you're a student and you're concerned about a friend, you could probably go and talk to that counselor and say, hey, I'm concerned about this friend, what do I do? And that would be a good connection. Or, so a lot of times that's available. I've had clients bring, their friend is the one that makes the phone call or brings them to therapy. And that's
Mm.
great. Whatever it takes, definitely.
I yeah, I love that you can approach therapy and approach counseling and approach professional care with a bit of creativity. That you can ask if your loved one would like some company going to an appointment or not. Like it's asking questions is free when it
Right.
comes
And
to
I honestly,
seeking.
I think it's great when a loved one, even if they're not in the same home, call me and say, "Hey, I'm calling for my niece or my grandson, or I'm calling for my neighbor, and I just want to get resources. Would you reach out to them?" That I think that's great. So sometimes it is doing some of that legwork yourself. I'll also interject too. I don't know if you're probably going to talk about this, but the crisis text line is a
Mm,
great way to offer resources to someone. And people think, well, the crisis text line is only for, suicidal, ideation or things like that. No, you can use it also for self harm, eating disorders, things like that. To even just as an moment by moment
mm.
intervention, just to get the help that this person might need in that moment, and having that accessible, giving that to a friend or saying, hey, here's a number I want you to text when you're feeling bad, or, you could probably speak to more of that, Chad, about the crisis
No, I
text
mean,
line.
I love what's being drawn out here, the diversity of access points for care, whether that's telehealth, whether that's crisis text line, or one of our other numerous resources that you can find on our website, whether that's
Mhm.
finding a therapist or just finding another network or helpline along the way. And I think that that's really important to draw out because not all conversations when it deals with helping someone find help needs to feel like an intervention, right? Like it can be casual. It can actually even be uh, a kind of self-revelatory. The benefit of being the one to break the ice on behalf of your friend or family member, saying, like I used to feel this way too, or I'm familiar with what it feels like to not know what to do with certain pain, or even if it is relevant to your experience, talking about your journey with self-injury in the hopes of helping someone else. So often people are ready to have the conversation about mental health care, but they're less willing to start the conversation. That can be a really emotionally jarring proposition. So that's where I think loved ones can really stand in the gap, to go more than halfway, to say, "Hey, I'm waiting out this far. Meet me wherever you feel comfortable." And if the conversation gets too deep, then we'll back off. We can return to this whenever. So it kind of in the spirit of this, not all conversations have to look alike, and um, not all of our nudges towards help need to look like cannonballs into outpatient or inpatient therapy. Like there's so many ways that you can access help, and that's because there's so many ways that people have a relationship with the behavior of self-injury. So, in that direction, how might the support of a loved one differ depending on if the person is actively in a state of struggle, or maybe has relapsed, or maybe if they're in recovery? How do the roles of care kind of subtly shift depending on um, the the specific circumstance of the person who may be struggling?
Yeah, I think it can vary. You have to approach it knowing yourself and what you're comfortable with, what you feel comfortable sharing, disclosing, your comfort level, and kind of going there. There may be just misunderstanding. You may not understand what's going on. It may scare
Mm,
you. And so I think it's uh, just taking a look inside of like what's going on in me, and what comes up, and how might that affect or impact how I approach the situation with this loved one. And I think in starting the conversation, lots of things happen, and we're access to information all the time. And so, whether it's in your community, in your school, or at work, or even just watching the news or on social media, there's things that happen that impact us. And so sometimes even just talking about mental health topics or things like that happen in our communities, in our, in on the media, can be, conversation points. And I think a lot of times I think sometimes we're scared to ask the question, or scared to approach certain topics because we don't know how it's going to end up. We don't want to offend the person. We don't want to scare them off. But, and I always err on the side of like, no question is bad. No. I mean, yes, there's, probably better ways of saying things, but I think, just asking the question or being curious about what might be going on or how the person's doing, and then also checking in with yourself of like, how might this impact me? How am I doing? And being able to, regulate that as well, and only approaching things if you're comfortable, because you have to sort
Mm.
of be responsible for yourself in that as well. So if you're still in recovery and talking about this with somebody who is actively struggling, or everybody is always in recovery, but let's say you're at a vulnerable place, you may not want to engage, or it may be hard for you. And I think it's okay to have some boundaries around that, and know, okay, there may be places I can't go with this person, um,
Mm.
and that's okay. I have to, first and foremost, be mindful of where I am and what I need to do to protect myself and protect my recovery. So, that in doing so, that actually does help the other person. Does that make sense,
Yeah.
Jen?
Oh, that is so good. That is so,
Yeah. So
so
like,
good. I
if
mean,
you're, struggling, and your spouse or your friend or loved one is struggling too, it's kind of like you have to kind of take care of yourself first.
right. I've heard you and Aaron use this metaphor time and again. If you've been on an airplane before,
Right.
they tell you how to use the mask. And rule one of wearing a mask, if they deploy, is put your own on first
Mhm.
before you help someone affix theirs. And yeah, I think that's a super important thing to acknowledge in this conversation, is that not all people who are care providers or loved ones of people who are struggling um, are devoid of their own experience with self-injury. I think in many ways the the trope of it takes one to know one can come as a huge benefit, like you were saying. Like this will give you an opportunity to have a point of legitimate connection with someone who
Mhm.
may be struggling if you
Mhm.
yourself are in recovery. But be sure that you are modeling self-care as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
So it strikes me that that posture is having a consistent posture is more important than having the right words or the right resources or the
Mhm.
right answers for all the questions. But uh, yeah, just having that kind of air of non-judgmental, positive regard and humility, and giving space for the person to share to the degree that they are comfortable sharing, like all of that. It takes practice, but just rehearsing it won't be enough. It's really about
Right.
checking in. Yeah.
I will also interject too, if like you're a parent listening to our conversation, and you're not somebody who struggles with self-harm, but your child is, that, realizing you may not be that person for them to process what's going on. And that's okay
Yeah.
too, that you are providing, access to care if that's what's needed, or you're giving space. You're also listening. But oftentimes, as parents, we want to fix things. We want to make the problem go away. We want to solve the problem. And sometimes it's a little, trickier than that. We can't just fix it. And so it's relying on sometimes other people, other professionals to help us and give them the access to that care, and realizing it's not anything about you per se as the parent, but it's okay that person is talking to their, you know, counselor about it, or their psychiatrist about it, or that they first opened up to the nurse at the doctor's office, and the fact that they felt comfortable to share, I think, is what is good. And just to keep encouraging those relationships that do help them, most and foremost. Yeah, but that I feel like that's hard. That's a hard one as a parent to realize, like, okay, I'm not the person for them to talk about this with completely. Maybe to some degree, but that other people are
Totally.
also in that circle of care, providing care and support.
I want to take a second and just verify that this resource still exists on our website. So if you go to TWLOHA.com/find help. That's where you're going to find To Write Love's resource hub. So if you look at the first bar that pops up, you're going to see a number of options regarding identity and also specific mental health challenges. So if you click on the self-injury tab, uh, towards the bottom where it says resources, the second thing listed right now is the Cornell Research Program on Self-Injury
Yeah,
and Recovery. And this is one of my favorite websites that exists on the
too.
internet, on the World Wide Web as it
Yes,
pertains to
yes,
self-injury. Um, a number of really great tools and tips, especially for caregivers and loved ones, on how you can educate yourself, on how you can frame some of these conversations, on ways that you can, um, you know, practice patience before we really dive deeply into offering help. But that is certainly a resource that I am. I give out all the time at the
yes,
booth. And Michelle, I'm pretty sure it was you that put that resource on our radar. So
yeah.
hat tip to you.
Yeah, it's important to, educate yourself, right? Because there is a lot of mis misunderstandings in this. There's a lot of stigma, and so it's important to educate yourself as much as you can, regardless of if it's self-injury. That's a great resource. If it's eating disorders or depression or post-traumatic stress, like whatever might be going on, to educate yourself on that
Mm,
topic or on those issues so that you can be better prepared. Because in some ways, the more you know, the more that you can offer and extend that help, or it's powerful. So I'm so
yeah.
glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think this also hits on another angle to the conversation in that we've been talking about people who are pretty decently sure that self-injury is a piece of the equation for a friend or a loved one. The reality is shame can make us into some surprisingly effective actors, and especially as we try to seek to hide or cover up certain traits or struggles or behaviors or signs. So, all that to say, it is entirely possible to have friends and loved ones in your life who are self injuring, and yet you're unaware. What would you say, Michelle, to someone who feels as if they've missed the signs, that they've dropped the ball, that they've maybe failed someone they love and not spotting some of these signs?
Yeah, I mean, you're human, you know. We all miss it. We all, and I think as like a parent myself, like realizing that there's certain things that I miss as a parent, and that's okay. It's having that self compassion, being able to let go of that judgment towards yourself. But I would say it's very common for parents to be unaware of what may be going on behind the scenes. And sometimes it is, there's many different factors because of that. And so after you get off the initial shock, because there is shock when it comes to, finding out that your loved one is struggling, it's then checking in with yourself of like, what is coming up for me and how am I caring for myself in that? And also, okay, moving into action mode of like, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we're human, and it's, unfortunately things get missed. I remember it was way before I had kids. We were had some friend. We were talking with some friends, and this particular friend, she was a counselor. I met her in graduate school, and I guess her son was like later in elementary school, maybe kindergarten, first grade, and so he finally was getting his eyes checked, and he basically the eye doctor was like, this kid can't see, and the mom was like, what do you mean? And he's like, he's got some, he's definitely going to need glasses, and here's the treatment plan. But the shock of that mom was like, how did I miss the signs that my son could not see? Right. And I remember talking with her, and her sharing her just disbelief, and also the grief that comes with that, because she was so beating herself up about it, like, what kind of mom am I that I missed that my son needed glasses probably from the time he was born till now. And just offering her care and concern and empathy, then she could have compassion and care for herself, that hey, we miss things. And that story always sticks out to me in talking about like mental health stuff, because sometimes things go unnoticed, and it's not necessarily because we miss it. It's just, sometimes it is life. But does that make sense?
And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And again, that kind of draws out something we were talking about earlier, is that in this case, success for this parent uh, wasn't on you. You don't get a failing grade for you not being able to see the world through the literal eyes of your child, um,
Mm-hmm.
but you do get positive marks for then reacting to the the new revelation appropriately. That's the sign of a good parent, is not building a time machine to to fix a problem before you're even aware of it, but rather, as we get this new information, how does this affect the level of care that we're providing as we go? So
Mm-hmm.
if the response was, well, he never told me when he was 2 that he couldn't see, so surely, doc, you're wrong. We're gonna go on without providing, access to glasses or one-day contacts, or you name it. Anyway, I maybe followed that metaphor a bit too far, but
I think you're totally right. It's your response, and sometimes you try, first you try one method, that's not working, you try another method, and sometimes that's the course of treatment, and the course of like, in terms of what I see is like, okay, you maybe tried to, figure out things on your own without eliciting professional help, and then finally you do, and you're like kicking yourself because you waited too long. I think it's like, okay, yes, there's grief that comes with all of this, and recognizing those emotions and those feelings, and acknowledging that, I think, is the first step towards then, okay, now what do we want to do about it? All right, this didn't work, so let's try this. And I am a huge proponent of looking at, if we're going to professional help, making sure that, okay, the people that we're seeing are, licensed and credentialed, and are following, you know, evidence-based methods to help my loved one with what, self-harm. So
yeah. Kind of on the flip side of that, the I never knew, I missed the signs, moving into the idea of, it's the conversation that's lacking, not my observation. Maybe some people just feel just stunned, deer in the headlights when it comes to
mhm.
having this conversation. They feel like they lack the words, and therefore they lack the conversation in total. What are some things that loved ones can do to prove that they are safe spaces for help
Mm,
and for their conversation?
mm. That's a good question, Chad. I I think it is recognizing, I know I keep saying this, but I think it's recognizing the feelings and emotions and thoughts that come up for yourself, you know, and being able to be aware of that and conscious of that, I think helps to then create a safe place for that person to open up to you. So like
Mm.
if you're coming at it from like a very anxious or fearful if you're feeling that fear and anxiety, oftentimes that does get translated to your loved one. And so just being mindful of that, like being aware of those, what it brings up in you, and kind of having other people to check in with, you know, and to talk to about it, I think is helpful. I think also recognizing that it's okay if you are not that person, to be that safe place, that you can provide avenues or access to a safe place. And sometimes that is therapy or a counselor or psychiatrist or even a doctor or a health provider, but it's creating those avenues. So yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's hard, it's uh because sometimes, especially when you're parenting or caring for someone, there is going to be things that you feel yourself. And so that's what makes relationships really messy. And it's not clear cut, it's not so well defined. And so I think as much as you can be aware of that, then you can, kind of have outlets for how you deal with that. I was talking to a friend not long ago, and they just were like, I am so freaked out. I just want to take them to the hospital right now. And because this self harm is freaking me out. And, it's like, I'm so glad that they called me and not said that to, their loved one, that they're able to have a space and an avenue to process their fear and whatever is coming up for them. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's fear, maybe it's something else, sadness, grief, but having an avenue to talk about it for yourself. So then you can be at a place where you can come with that, approach that person and, offer them that just space, just room,
Yeah.
um, metaphorically, space and room, and let them know that you're there. Let them know that you care and you want to be that for them. And it may even be asking them what you can do to help be a safe place. You know, um,
Yeah, I love that idea of like not assuming that you have to have all the answers,
yeah, yeah,
and proving that you're comfortable with asking questions. And just speaking from the voice of experience here, as I'm sure many people who struggle with self injury can relate. We're good at reading the room. We're good at taking notes. We are
mm-hmm.
always watching. We are always listening. I know who's making the jokes about self-injury. I know who is using really insensitive language when it comes to depression, when it comes to heartache, when it comes to mental health. I take note when someone watches a news story and says, "Oh, like that person is crazy." Like
Mm-hmm.
these are things that people pick up on.
Good
And
point.
really the only way to combat that is to give evidence of the opposite, that you are someone, if you're in a room and someone cracks a joke about mental health, I'm also going to be aware of who is kind of shifting in their seat, who's rolling their eyes, who is even speaking up to say, "Hey, that's hurtful," or "Hey, like surely we can find a better way of talking about this." So I think that is something that's so important. Is just being aware that like low hanging fruit, the easy and obvious jokes about mental health, it doesn't take a lot of effort to not engage with those, and that can be such a benefit to people who are trying to look around the room and see who is safe and who is not. Um, Related, this is as recent as just a couple weeks ago. My sister, who's aware of my journey and struggles in recovery, was in town with her oldest boy, with my oldest nephew, for a soccer tournament, and we go out to eat. And I forget how the conversation came up, but she mentioned at one point, like, uh, just how much time has passed and how much her son has grown up. And I mentioned, yeah, like, it's been a privilege to watch him grow up, and it's been an honor, to see him, even before he knew it, have an impact on my life. And that was an open door to talking about how my nephews, when they were even just 1 year old and 2 years old and 3 years old, were an inspiration for me to get help, to take steps away from self-injury. And now my nephew, who is just about to turn 18, I hope that sent him a message that, if he ever comes in close proximity with a mental health challenge, that he knows I'm a safe place, that I'm not afraid of these conversations, and that, even if he feels alone, at least maybe he remembers that Uncle Chad had felt the same way at some point. So yeah, I think this kind of goes back to the theme of posture, over precise answers.
So you told your nephew you had struggled and he was the reason for why you wanted to recover?
Yeah, we had that
Wow,
conversation over sushi. Yeah.
that's
So
amazing. That's
yeah, I'm
amazing.
super thankful to have that conversation. And
Mm,
yeah, I don't know, like, it feels good to be known on kind of that level with someone who,
mhm,
uh yeah, who's kind of the next generation of my family
mhm.
story. So it's,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
Well,
great,
not
Chad.
to keep this all yeah, thank you, but, not to step out of the spotlight for a second. I wanna, definitely take some time. There's never a bad time to dispel some myths. So before we log off on this conversation, uh, just want to take some time to hear from a licensed mental health professional addressing some lies that we commonly believe and commonly come across when it comes to self injury. Line number one is that self injury is strictly a young person, an adolescent challenge. And two, we've probably already touched on this. I don't know if we need to, save this for the last question, but the idea that it's an attention seeking behavior. So, just how do you, as a mental health professional, engage and dispel and educate, against these myths and frequently held beliefs?
Mhm. Well, I think it's good to check out resources like that Cornell website that offers a list of common misconceptions and replaces it with facts. So I think that's really helpful to know that and review that, as well as, like, it is recognizing that self-harm often is a coping mechanism. It is a response to something else, and it's not an intent to end someone's life. So that's a big myth. In terms of it being attention seeking, that is often very common misconception. What I would say is be a little bit more curious about why, what motivates that person and why they're using, what function does the self-harm serve that person. And so it could be a way to communicate, it could be a way to cry for help, it could be to ask for help. And you can't assume. And so it's good to ask the question and say, why, I'm curious, like, what does this do for you? How does this help you? I know it's a coping mechanism, I know it serves that function, but how can you, if they're willing to go there with you. But understanding, like, if you feel like it is attention seeking, that there's probably more going on there, that there's more to this story. There's more to that just explanation. And oftentimes I feel like it's a way to communicate. It's a way to ask for help. It's a way to let other people know I'm not okay. I'm hurting. I'm not doing well. I'm not good. I'm not okay. Uh, Other times it is a way to cope. It's a way for them to keep living, to keep surviving, to keep going on. And so sometimes it is just not making that assumption, but asking, hey, what's going on for you in this? And that may be hard for
Yeah.
sure.
No, Michelle, thank you so much for your time and for your
Yeah.
wisdom and just one more just announcement of uh, peace and compassion to people who may be finding this episode in a moment of struggle. Maybe people who have wound up at this episode because they are at their wits' end and they don't know where else to turn to for hope, for help. I hope that this can be a source of proof that there are people like me who have been there, who have been able to benefit from hope and help from professionals and from friends and from
Mhm.
family members. Proof that people like Michelle exist, people that have sought a profession in which they can consistently care for you and your loved ones. At no point are you or your friends or family alone in any of this. And
Yeah.
yeah, Michelle, again, just so great to spend some time in space with you, virtual as it may be. I'm glad we
Yes.
were able to do this. Y'all have no idea how the links to which Michelle went in order to make this episode possible.
Hey, do whatever
But
it takes,
thank you
right?
again so much.
Yes.
And
Thank
whatever it
you.
takes.